how German intelligence misjudged American industrial might, there is a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable on the surface, that I find myself returning to more than any other when I think seriously about the Second World War. Not the beaches of Normandy, not the fires of Dresden, not the liberation of the camps. There is a moment that happened earlier, in a room away from the cameras, that in many ways contains the entire arc of what was to come. It was a cold December morning in 1941, inside the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Adolf Hitler had just received word that Japanese aircraft had struck the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, destroying much of the United States Pacific Fleet, and according to the first-hand account of his own naval adjutant, Admiral Karl Jesko von Puttkamada, a man who was there, who watched it happen, the Führer was not cautious. He was not calculating. He was not carefully weighing the strategic implications of a global conflict on two oceanic fronts. He threw what you can only describe as a celebration. His senior staff gave themselves over to what one eyewitness called an ecstasy of rejoicing. The mood in the room was one of triumph, of vindication, of relief. 4 days later, Adolf Hitler voluntarily declared war on the United States of America. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Really, sit with it. Germany had been at war since September 9. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, and the Soviet Union. Its armies were at that very moment freezing and dying in the Russian snow outside Moscow, having failed to capture the city before winter closed in. Its air force had failed to break Britain in the Battle of Britain the previous year. Its submarine campaign in the Atlantic was costing it crews and vessels it could not easily replace. Its economy, for all the armaments it was producing, was stretched thin across an enormous continent. And at the precise moment when any rational calculation of strategic interest demanded restraint, when the last thing Germany could afford was another enormous, powerful, and as yet uncommitted enemy, Hitler celebrated. He celebrated because he didn't understand what he was looking at. He celebrated because the men whose job it was to explain the United States of America to him had, for years, been telling him something that was fundamentally, catastrophically, and in the most consequential way imaginable wrong. That failure is what I want to talk to you about today, not just because it's a fascinating story, though it absolutely is, but because it is a story about something that repeats itself through history with terrible regularity, about what happens when powerful institutions stop trying to understand the world as it actually is, and start trying to understand it as their ideology demands it should be, and about the price paid, in the end, by everyone, when reality finally arrives. Subscribe if you want more of this. We're going to go deep today. Let's begin. Before we can understand how badly German intelligence got America wrong, we have to understand the intellectual and ideological architecture that shaped everything they believed about it. And to do that, we have to travel back to a single moment in 1918, a moment that cast a shadow over everything that followed. On November 11, 1918, the armistice ending the First World War went into effect. Germany had been fighting for more than 4 years. Its army was retreating across the Western Front. Its home front was starving under the Allied naval blockade. Its allies, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, were collapsing or had already collapsed. The Kaiser had abdicated 2 days earlier. Revolution was spreading through the cities. The new civilian government signed the armistice and the war ended. Now, here is the crucial thing. At the moment the armistice was signed, German soldiers were still on foreign soil. The fighting had not reached German territory in any significant way. The trenches, the mud, the wire, artillery, all of that had been from beginning to end, in Belgium and France and Russia and elsewhere. Not in Germany. The German army had not been defeated in a final, decisive battle on German soil. There had been no equivalent of Appomattox, no moment of obvious, undeniable military surrender in the field. Into this vacuum of obvious defeat, a narrative rushed in, a lie. One of the most consequential lies in modern history. The German army, this narrative claimed, had not been beaten in the field. The German soldiers had been stabbed in the back by communist agitators, by defeatists, by Jews, by the weak civilian politicians who had surrendered when the frontline fighters were still capable of fighting on. This was the Tolstoy legend, the stab-in-the-back myth. It was embraced enthusiastically by officers who needed an explanation for defeat that preserved their professional honor, by right-wing politicians who needed a villain to blame for Germany's humiliation, and eventually, most passionately and most consequentially, by a wounded, bitter, politically radioactive Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler, who had been hospitalized with mustard gas wounds when the news came and who, by his own later account, wept in his bunk when he heard that Germany had surrendered. The stab-in-the-back myth had a specific, profound, and largely ignored strategic consequence. If Germany had not really been beaten militarily in 1918, if the army had been winning on the battlefield right up until the moment the traitor surrendered, American participation in that war hadn't really been decisive. The 2 million American soldiers who had crossed the Atlantic, the American industrial output that had resupplied the exhausted British and French, the American money and credit that had kept the Allied war effort going, the American food that had fed Allied civilians and soldiers, none of it had actually mattered in this telling, because the Germans would have won anyway. Hitler believed this. He believed it completely, passionately, unshakably. He had spent his adult life constructing an ideological worldview, and at its foundation was this conviction that Germany had been cheated of victory in 1918, not by American military or industrial power, but by internal betrayal. Therefore, American military and industrial power was a myth, a legend. A convenient story the Allies told to explain why they hadn't beaten Germany on the battlefield, which was itself a story required to cover up the stab in the back. You see how this works. One lie requires another to sustain it, and eventually you build a complete alternative picture of reality, internally consistent, ideologically satisfying, and catastrophically wrong. This was the foundation on which the entire German assessment of America rested, and it was rotten from the very first brick. Let me tell you what Adolf Hitler actually believed about the United States in specific terms, because his views were documented, they were articulated clearly, and they reveal a mindset that was not simply misinformed but ideologically structured to resist correct information. By the late 1930s, Hitler had told associates and recorded in various conversations that the United States was not going to be a world power until 1970 or 1980 at the earliest. He wasn't saying this as a strategic calculation with some analytical basis. He was saying it as an expression of his racial theory of history, in which the dominant factor determining national power was racial purity and discipline, and the United States, in his framework, was a racially contaminated society, a mixture of Northern Europeans, Southern Europeans, Jews, Africans, Asians, and every other group imaginable, and therefore constitutionally incapable of the kind of unified national will he associated with genuine military greatness. This is where ideology meets intelligence assessment in a particularly destructive way, because what Hitler's racial framework did, functionally, was give him a mechanism for dismissing any American achievement or capability as either temporary, overstated, or irrelevant. If America produced impressive industrial output, it must be Jewish-financed propaganda or unsustainable boom economics. If American soldiers showed bravery, it must be the German or Anglo-Saxon stock in them that was responsible. If American political institutions held together under pressure, it must be because the pressure hadn't been serious enough yet. There was the famous moment already mentioned, but worth expanding on, when the Orson Welles broadcast of the War of the Worlds caused widespread panic among American radio listeners in October 1938. A dramatized reading of the H.G. Wells story about a Martian invasion was so realistic that thousands of people believed an actual alien invasion was occurring. There was genuine panic in parts of the country. When Hitler learned about this, his reported reaction was to gloat. To him, this proved everything. Americans were hysterical cowards. A society that panicked in response to a radio play could not mount the kind of sustained, stoic, national effort that serious warfare required. What Hitler could not see, what his ideology prevented him from seeing, was that the panic was a product of the novelty of the medium and a specific set of circumstances, not evidence of some fundamental American psychological weakness. What he also could not see was that the same capacity for emotional intensity, for passionate response to perceived threat, that produced the panic in 1938 would also produce the extraordinary outpouring of national commitment that followed. December 7, 1941. He saw the fear. He never considered what that same emotional intensity would look like when it turned from fear into anger. Hermann Rien, the head of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful figure in Nazi Germany, was if anything even more contemptuous of American capabilities than Hitler was. Göring had a particular contempt for American aviation, which was, of course, his professional domain. He dismissed American aircraft as technically inferior, American pilots as and American aviation industry as incapable of serious large-scale production. When specific intelligence reports crossed his desk, suggesting otherwise, he was known to simply reject them as exaggerations or Allied propaganda. This kind of willful blindness at the top of the decision-making chain had cascading effects. Intelligence analysts who produced assessments favorable to their leaders' pre-existing beliefs were rewarded with status and advancement. Analysts who produced assessments that challenged those beliefs found their work questioned, minimized, or buried. Over time, this created a self-reinforcing institutional culture in which the correct thing, professionally, personally, politically, was to tell the leadership what it wanted to hear. The result was an intelligence apparatus that was not so much incompetent as it was structurally deformed. It had the personnel, the data, the technical capacity to understand American industrial potential. What it didn't have was the institutional freedom to say what that potential actually implied. The Abwehr, as I mentioned, was Germany's military intelligence service. I want to spend some time with it, because understanding the Abwehr is essential to understanding how Germany's intelligence picture of America was constructed and how it went so wrong. The Abwehr had been operating since the early 1920s, had been reorganized and professionalized through the 1930s, and by the beginning of the war had agents and informants across most of the world. Its mandate was broad: foreign intelligence, military intelligence, sabotage operations, counterintelligence. At various points, it employed thousands of officers and operatives. It had substantial resources, significant technical capabilities, and connections across the international intelligence community. And yet, the organization was, in the most fundamental sense, broken. Not in its surface capabilities, but in its soul. Its head, Admiral Wilhelm was a man of genuine intelligence and sophistication, who understood, probably earlier than almost anyone else in a senior German position, that Hitler was leading Germany to catastrophe. The historical record is clear on this point. Canaris was quietly, carefully, probably genuinely opposed to many of the regime's policies. He was in contact with German resistance circles. He may have deliberately allowed some intelligence failures to occur that benefited the Allies. This put the Abwehr in an extraordinary position. Its chief was, to varying degrees, an internal opponent of the regime it was supposed to serve. The SS Heinrich Himmler's security apparatus, which was in constant rivalry with the Abwehr for intelligence preeminence, was aware of this and worked systematically to undermine Canaris and his organization. The SS put Abwehr officers under investigation for suspected disloyalty. It accused Canaris himself of being defeatist in his intelligence assessments. The rivalry between these two institutions was so corrosive that at times the German intelligence community was more focused on fighting itself than on understanding its enemies. This was the environment in which assessments of American industrial capacity were being produced. On one side, analysts who might have wanted to tell the truth, but understood the professional and eventually the personal risks of doing so. On the other side, ideologically committed leadership that had strong priors about what the correct conclusions should be. And cutting across both, an institutional rivalry that rewarded appearing strong and capable even when honesty would have required admitting uncertainty or weakness. The specific failure to assess American industrial capacity correctly had multiple dimensions. Part of it was a mirror imaging problem I mentioned earlier. German planners assumed that American industrial mobilization would look like German industrial mobilization: slow, bureaucratic, top-down, constrained by the institutional habits of peace. What they didn't model was the distinctive character of American capitalism, which was far more flexible, far more decentralized, and far more capable of rapid adaptation than anything in the German system. Part of it was a data collection problem. The Abwehr had agents in the United States. Yes, but the United States was an open society with a free press. Everything that mattered about American industrial capacity was publicly available in newspapers, in corporate annual reports, in congressional testimony, in trade publications. The problem wasn't that the data didn't exist. The problem was the interpretation. The analysts who were looking at this publicly available information were working within an ideological framework that structurally discounted what they were seeing, and part of it was a compound problem of motivated reasoning. The German strategic plan required a certain assumption about American industrial mobilization time. If you acknowledged that American industry could convert to war production in months rather than years, the entire German strategic timeline became unworkable. The plan required America to be slow, so the intelligence assessments said America would be slow, and nobody pushed back hard enough for long enough to change the official picture. I want to introduce you to a man whose story runs through this entire period like a thread, and whose fate illustrates something important about what it means to understand the world correctly in a system that doesn't reward correct understanding. His name was Hans Heinrich Dieck. He served as Germany's ambassador to the United States from May 1937 until November 1938, when diplomatic relations between the two countries deteriorated badly following Germany's annexation of Austria and the events of when the United States recalled its ambassador from Berlin, Germany recalled Dieck in response, and he returned to Germany carrying a picture of America that was, in important ways, accurate, and that his government was entirely unprepared to hear. Dieck had lived in the United States. He had traveled the country. He had met Americans from different backgrounds, different classes, different parts of the enormous national landscape. He had observed American political culture up close, watched how American public opinion worked, seen firsthand the depth of anti-German sentiment that was already spreading through American society by the late 1930s. From 1938 onward, Dieck produced a series of memoranda to the German Foreign Ministry that stand, in retrospect, as a remarkable record of correct analysis. He warned, clearly and specifically, that American isolationism could not be assumed to last indefinitely. He pointed out that events in Europe were moving in a direction that would increasingly push American public opinion toward engagement. He noted that the Roosevelt administration was systematically preparing American public opinion, the American military, and American industry for eventual conflict, even as it publicly maintained a posture of neutrality. He analyzed the structure of American political opinion and the mechanisms by which it could shift, and warned that a single dramatic event, a Pearl Harbor, could flip American public sentiment almost overnight. He wrote, in direct terms, that Germany faced the prospect of having to fight the combined power of Britain and the United States, and he suggested, as diplomatically as he could manage, that this was a prospect Germany could not survive. These warnings were noted. They were filed, and they were not acted upon. The reasons are instructive. Dieck was not a senior enough figure to command the attention of Hitler directly. The Foreign Ministry, under Joachim von Ribbentrop, was not a place where uncomfortable analysis was welcomed. Ribbentrop himself was one of the most sycophantic and intellectually limited of the senior Nazi figures, a man whose primary qualification for his position was his early and enthusiastic loyalty to Hitler. The memoranda existed. The analysis was available, but the institutional structure of the Nazi state was extraordinarily effective at filtering uncomfortable truths out of the decision-making process. There's another figure worth considering here. Karl Hochschäfer was one of Germany's most distinguished geopolitical thinkers, a professor at the University of Munich who had been a mentor to Rudolf Hess and whose ideas about geopolitics and Lebensraum had influenced Hitler's thinking about continental expansion. Hochschäfer had traveled widely. He was not a man who dismissed American power easily, and when he returned from a visit to the United States in 1938, he reportedly told senior figures in the German government something that should have registered as an alarm bell: that America was potentially the world's foremost political and economic power. predestined to dominate world affairs once it fully committed itself to power politics, not a future rival, not an eventual challenger, potentially the world's foremost power. Already, in 1938, this was not a secret communication. This was a respected intellectual figure, connected to the highest levels of the Nazi leadership, telling them what he had seen with his own eyes. And even this made no difference, because the ideological commitment to the idea of American weakness was so deeply rooted, so structurally embedded, that even the testimony of respected observers couldn't dislodge it. Now I want to give you the numbers. The actual numbers, because I think sometimes in telling stories like this, we can let the drama of personalities and ideology obscure the sheer physical scale of what Germany was ignoring when it dismissed American industrial capacity. The numbers are, honestly, almost impossible to process. But let me try. In 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and the war began, the United States military was, by any reasonable measure, modest. The army had fewer than 200,000 men under arms, ranking it roughly 18th in the world by size. Tier Corps. It wasn't yet the Air Force had perhaps 3,000 military aircraft, most of them obsolete by European standards. The Navy was powerful but focused on the Pacific theater and structured around a doctrine and fleet composition developed in the 1920s. American military spending was a fraction of German military spending. American infantry divisions were under-equipped and under-trained by the standards of forces that had been fighting and learning since 1939. If you looked only at those facts, and German intelligence was, in many ways, looking only at those facts, America looked like a long-term potential problem, not an immediate threat. But those facts were measuring the wrong things. They were measuring the current state of the military establishment, not the potential of the industrial and human infrastructure that sat behind it. What the correct analysis would have looked like, had anyone been permitted to produce it, went something like this. The United States had the largest GDP of any nation on Earth. Its industrial base, its steel mills in Pittsburgh and Cleveland, its automobile plants in Detroit and Flint, its chemical plants along the Ohio River, its shipyards in Baltimore and Norfolk and San Diego and Seattle, its aluminum and rubber and coal and oil was, in aggregate, larger than the industrial base of Germany and all its occupied territories combined. Not slightly larger, enormously larger. The American workforce was one of the most skilled in the world. Decades of industrial capitalism had produced a vast pool of workers who understood machinery, who could operate lathes and milling machines and welding equipment, who had been trained in technical schools and apprenticeship programs and by years of factory work. This was not unskilled labor that could be directed to produce war material only with difficulty. This was a workforce with the kind of broad-based technical competency that made rapid industrial retooling not just possible, but, in many areas, almost natural. The American financial system could mobilize capital at a scale and speed that European governments couldn't match. War bonds issued to the American public between 1941 and 1945 raised over $185 billion in wartime dollars. The American banking system could finance war production on credit, confident that the underlying productive capacity of the economy would ultimately service the debt. This kind of financial flexibility allowed the American war economy to sprint at a pace that a more capital-consuming economy couldn't sustain. And underlying all of this was the simple geographic fact that the continental United States was essentially invulnerable to German military attack. Its factories weren't going to be bombed by the Luftwaffe. Its railroads weren't going to be cut by German armored divisions. Its workers weren't going to be terrorized by German occupation forces. The American industrial base could run at full capacity, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for the entire duration of the war, with nothing more disruptive than labor disputes and supply bottlenecks to worry about. German industrial capacity, by contrast, was being steadily degraded. Allied bombing campaigns, eventually including enormous fleets of American heavy bombers flying from bases in England, were destroying factories, transportation infrastructure, fuel production facilities, and synthetic rubber plants. German workers were being killed and displaced. German cities were being reduced to rubble. The contrast in productive conditions between the two countries, as the war went on, grew wider with every passing month. When Roosevelt stood before Congress in May 1940 and called for the production of 185,000 warplanes over 2 years, the German reaction was, as I said, dismissal. Hitler's advisors told him it was propaganda. Göring reportedly laughed. In the years that followed, American factories produced more than 300,000 aircraft. 300,000 in a single year. 1944, American industry produced more aircraft than all the other major belligerents combined, not just the Axis. All the other including Britain and the Soviet Union. The Ford Motor Company built a factory at Willow Run in Michigan that became the single largest room in the history of the world. At that time, a building covering almost 67 acres, through which passed a mile-long assembly line. At its peak, that factory was producing a completed B-24 Liberator heavy bomber every 63 minutes. One factory, one type of aircraft, a 4-engine long-range strategic bomber of enormous complexity. One every 63 minutes. Henry Kaiser, a California industrialist who had never built a ship before the war, developed prefabrication techniques that reduced the time to build a Liberty cargo ship from about 8 months to an average of 24 days. One of his ships was famously launched 4 days and 15 hours after the keel was laid. The Germans were sinking ships. The Americans were building them faster than they could be sunk. By the end of the war, American manufacturers had produced, among other things, 96,318 bombers, 86,338 tanks and self-propelled guns, 2.4 million trucks, 6.5 million rifles, 12.5 million rifles and carbines, combined if you include all variants, and 41 billion rounds of ammunition. The United States produced 18.7 million tons of merchant shipping, the ships that carried all the other material to the theaters of war. It produced 807,000 military aircraft of all types. It produced quantities of supplies and equipment so vast that by 1944, nearly 2/3 of all Allied military equipment used in the entire war was of American manufacture. 2/3. One country. The country that German intelligence had assessed as too soft, too divided, too racially contaminated, and too politically paralyzed to mobilize effectively. The economic mobilization story has a human face, and I want to make sure we don't lose it in the statistics. When Roosevelt made the decision to seriously mobilize American industry in the spring of 1940, with France collapsing and Britain fighting alone, he faced a genuine organizational challenge. The federal government could not simply order private companies to make weapons. American capitalism didn't work that way. You had to persuade, incentivize, and organize. And to do that, Roosevelt recruited from the private sector itself. William Knudsen had spent decades in the automobile industry and eventually became president of General Motors, the largest automobile manufacturer in the world. He understood mass production the way few human beings alive in 1940 understood Italiano. When Roosevelt called him to Washington, Knudsen left a salary that was among the highest in American industry to work for the government for $1 a year. He assembled a team of industrialists and engineers and set about the task of converting the American economy to war production. The challenge was not technical. Exactly, American industry knew how to make things. The challenge was organizational, getting the right contracts written, the right incentives in place, the right tooling procured, the right workers trained, the right supply chains established, and Knudsen and his team were extraordinarily good at it. The automobile industry is the best example, because it was the largest and most sophisticated component of American manufacturing. Before the war, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler made cars. During the war, they made aircraft engines, tanks, trucks, jeeps, aircraft fuselages, artillery shells, and scores of other military items. They didn't make these things because they were good at making cars and hoped the skills would transfer. They made them because mass production, the art of breaking complex manufacturing tasks into simple, repeatable steps that could be performed by semi-skilled workers using standardized tooling, was transferable across product categories. The principles were the same. The organizational knowledge was the same, only the products changed. The same logic applied across American industry. Chemical companies that made fertilizers and paints made explosives and synthetic rubber. Textile companies that made civilian clothing made uniforms and parachutes. Electronics companies that made radios made radar equipment and communications gear. The productive capacity was vast, versatile, and already proven. It was waiting to be pointed in a new direction. There was also the question of workforce expansion before the war. Significant numbers of Americans who could have been working weren't either, because of Depression-era unemployment, because they were in school, or because social conventions kept women out of the industrial workforce. The war changed all of this. Millions of men who had been unemployed found work in defense plants. Millions of women entered the industrial workforce for the first time. The labor force expanded dramatically, and it expanded just as the productive capacity was expanding. Supply and demand of labor moved together in the same direction at the same time. None of this was spontaneous. It required government, policy, business organization, social mobilization, and above all, political will. Roosevelt provided that will most consequentially in his Arsenal of Democracy speech of December 1940, in which he told the American people directly that the United States would supply Britain and its allies with the material of war, and that this was both a moral obligation and a strategic necessity. The speech was a political masterstroke that began shifting American public opinion toward engagement, and it was also a signal to American industry that the government was ready to be a customer on a scale never before imagined. German intelligence watched all of this. Its agents reported on American war production preparations. Its analysts had access to the public record of American economic mobilization, and what they concluded, Abwehr and Abwehr, was that it was overstated, that American industry was incapable of converting this quickly, that the targets Roosevelt was announcing were propaganda, that the actual output would be a fraction of the claimed figures. They were wrong because they were looking at American industrial mobilization through the lens of their own experience. German industrial mobilization was centralized, bureaucratic, and often inefficient, not because German industry was bad, but because the political system surrounding it was incapable of the kind of flexible market-based adaptation that American capitalism enabled. German planners thought retooling a major factory for war production would take years, because in Germany it did take years. They didn't understand that in a system where ownership, incentive, and management were differently organized, the timeline could be measured in months. The summer of 1942 brings us to Operation Pastorius, a story I find both fascinating and, in a grim way, revealing of everything we've been discussing. By mid-1942, certain elements of German intelligence had arrived at a conclusion that was more realistic than most. They acknowledged that American industrial production was real, was growing, and was going to be a serious problem. The U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was killing Allied sailors and sinking Allied ships at a frightening rate. But American shipyards were replacing the losses almost as fast as they occurred. American aircraft production was accelerating. American factories were running around the clock. If this continued, and there was no reason to think it wouldn't, the material advantage of the Allies was going to become overwhelming within a year or two. So the thinking shifted. If you couldn't stop the output, perhaps you could disrupt the inputs. Hit the factories themselves. Destroy the infrastructure, the aluminum plants, the railroad bridges, the hydroelectric facilities, the water systems on which industrial production depended. Even temporary disruptions could impose strategic costs. Even partial success could buy time. This was the logic of Operation Pastorius. The planners were, in a narrow sense, correct about the strategic concept. If you could reliably destroy critical production nodes in the American industrial system, you could impose real costs. The aluminum production facilities that supplied aviation manufacturers were genuine choke points. The railroad infrastructure that moved coal and ore and finished goods was genuinely critical. The hydroelectric facilities that powered urban areas and industrial zones were vulnerable. A sustained, coordinated sabotage campaign run by professional operatives with real skills and genuine commitment might have caused significant disruption. The operation was named for Francis the founder of the first organized German settlement in North America. This choice of name tells you something about how the planners conceptualized the mission as a kind of return to something, a reassertion of German presence in America. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who headed the Abwehr, authorized the operation. Lieutenant Walter Kapp, an Abwehr officer who had spent 12 years in the United States before the war and spoke fluent English, was put in charge of recruiting and training the agents. Kapp's plan was, in concept, sensible. He wanted men who had actually lived in America, who knew American culture, spoke American English without a noticeable accent, could blend in and pass as ordinary workers. He turned to the Ausland Institute, a Nazi organization that had helped thousands of German Americans return to Germany during the 1930s. To identify candidates, he found 8 men who met his basic criteria: former American residents, English speakers, willing to go back. He gave them 80 days of intensive training at an Abwehr facility on a private estate outside Berlin. They learned to handle explosives. They were taught codes and covert communication techniques. They were drilled on their cover identities. They were given forged documents, birth certificates, driver's licenses, social security cards that would allow them to pass as American civilians. They were given approximately $175,000 in American currency to fund their operations over what was envisioned as a 2-year sabotage campaign. The target list was thoughtful in its selection: the aluminum plants in Tennessee and elsewhere that supply the aviation industry, the cryolite processing facility in Philadelphia that was essential to aluminum production, railroad bridges on major trunk lines, including the famous Horseshoe Curve near Pennsylvania, through which perhaps 20% of all East Coast rail traffic moved, hydroelectric facilities, and water treatment systems in major cities, canal locks on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers that were critical to freight movement in the interior of the country. In other words, Pastorius wasn't targeting random or symbolic targets. It was targeting the specific infrastructure that an accurate analysis of American industrial production had identified as critical nodes. In this sense, the planners had done better intelligence work than the analysts, who were dismissing American production as propaganda. They believed in American production enough to try to destroy it. What they got wrong, catastrophically wrong, was their assessment of the men they were sending to do the destroying. Let me tell you what happened. The 2 teams left France aboard U-boats in early June 1942. The first team, commanded by George Dosh, came ashore at Amagansett Beach on Long Island, New York, just after midnight on June 13th. They arrived in German Navy uniforms, the idea being that, if captured during the landing itself, they could claim prisoner of war status rather than being treated as spies. They buried their explosives in the sand, changed into civilian clothes, and prepared to make their way to New York City. And almost immediately, everything went wrong. A 21-year-old Coast Guard seaman named John Cullen was doing a foot patrol along the beach in the fog. He was unarmed. He had a flashlight that was proving useless in the conditions, and he stumbled across the landing party in the middle of their preparations. Dosh had armed men hiding in the dunes behind him who were waiting for a signal to kill the intruder. He didn't give it. He let Cullen go. He bribed him with $260, the only $260 that would be spent of the entire $175,000 budget the Abwehr had provided, and told him it was a chance encounter. Then Dosh and his team took the Long Island Railroad into Manhattan and checked into a hotel. George Dosh was not the man the Abwehr thought he was. He had lived in the United States for years. He had married an American woman. He had a son. When it came to the point of actually doing what he had been sent to do, blowing up the industrial infrastructure of a country he had lived in, among people he knew, he couldn't bring himself to do it. The night after arriving, he told Ernest Berger, the most guarded and disciplined member of his team, that he had no intention of carrying out the mission. He hated the Nazis. He was going to turn the whole thing over to the FBI. He called the FBI from New York under the code name Pastorius. Then he traveled to Washington, walked into FBI headquarters, and told them everything. Within 14 days, all 8 saboteurs were in custody. Not one act of sabotage had been committed. Not one bomb had had been placed. Not one railroad bridge had been targeted. Of the $175,000 provided for a 2-year campaign of industrial disruption, $174,388 remained. The only spending beyond the initial bribe had been on hotel rooms, meals, train tickets, and some civilian clothing. 6 of the 8 men were executed by electric chair on August 8, 1942. The German intelligence service was so shaken by the catastrophic failure that it never again sent a sabotage team to American soil. Operation Pastorius, Germany's one real attempt to directly disrupt American industrial production from within, had lasted 14 days and accomplished nothing. There are layers to this failure that are worth unpacking. The immediate cause is simple. Cap had recruited men who were not fundamentally true believers. They had lived in America. They had American wives, American friends, American children. When the ideological commitment of the Nazi state met the human reality of what they were being asked to do, the ideology lost. George Dosch and Ernest Berger were not cowards. It took considerable courage, in its own way, to walk into FBI headquarters and hand over a Nazi intelligence operation. They were men who, when it came down to it, didn't hate America enough to blow it up. German intelligence had assessed American society as weak, divided, corruptible, and fundamentally incapable of the kind of unified national loyalty that military effectiveness required. And then they sent 8 men to destroy that society, and found that some of those men had absorbed enough of America over the years they'd lived there to refuse. The deeper cause is the same one we've been tracing throughout this entire story. German intelligence was evaluating American society through an ideological lens that systematically distorted what it saw. It saw the divisions and the debates and the political arguments and concluded that America was weak. What it couldn't see was the social cohesion underneath the surface noise, the sense of common purpose that existed even in a pluralistic society, the patriotism that was real, even when it wasn't performative or militaristic. The fact that a country can argue loudly about politics while still being, in the ways that matter most under pressure, fundamentally together. Let me turn now to the military dimension of this misjudgment, because the story of American industrial capacity can't really be separated from the story of how that capacity translated into military force. The United States Army in 1941 was, as I've said, not impressive. It was small, under-equipped, and had not fought a modern war. When American forces first engaged German forces in North Africa in late 1942, the results were, in places, ugly. The disaster at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where Rommel's Abwehr Corps broke through American lines, inflicted serious casualties, and demonstrated that American infantry and armor were not ready to fight experienced German forces, was exactly the kind of evidence that confirmed Hitler's contempt. "Americans are no soldiers," he reportedly said. German officers who observed the early American performance concluded that what they were seeing was what they had expected: a soft, undisciplined military from a soft, undisciplined society. They were wrong about what they were observing. They were seeing the beginning of a learning curve, not a fixed endpoint. The American military did something after Kasserine Pass that German intelligence had not anticipated. It learned commanders who had performed poorly were replaced. Tactics that had failed were analyzed and changed. Training was intensified. Cooperation between infantry, armor, and air support was practiced and refined. The lessons of the first major engagement with German forces were absorbed at an institutional level with a speed and thoroughness that German officers, looking at the performance of early 1943, had not thought possible. By the time of the breakout from Normandy in the summer of 1944, the American military was a fundamentally different organization from the one that had stumbled at Kasserine, and behind it was an industrial machine that was providing it with material at a scale that German forces, who were already short of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacements, simply could not match. This is the point where the industrial story and the military story become one story. By 1944, an American division could call in aerial bombardment from hundreds of aircraft, receive artillery support from scores of guns, advance with tanks, and mechanized infantry in coordinated operations, maintain its tempo of attack for days or weeks because its logistics were supplied from a virtually inexhaustible industrial base, and replace its losses faster than German forces could inflict them. This was not American soldiers being braver or more skilled than German soldiers in many specific engagements. German forces continued to perform tactically better right up to the end of the war. This was American industrial capacity translating directly, comprehensively, and irreversibly into military advantage. Albert Speer, who became German armaments minister in February 1942, understood this dynamic clearly. He was, in many ways, the most rational and capable administrator in the Nazi government. A man who could see past ideology to physical reality, who understood what the numbers actually meant. He worked heroically to rationalize German industrial production, to eliminate waste, to increase output through every available means. And he succeeded. German tank and aircraft production actually increased through 1943 and into 1944. Even as Allied bombing was degrading German industrial capacity, Speer was genuinely remarkable at his job. But Speer himself understood, probably by mid-1943, at Tilletess, that the race was lost. Not because German production was failing, though eventually it would, but because the gap between what Germany could produce and what the Allies, led by American industry, were producing was too large and growing too fast to close. He was, as he put it in later writings, bailing a sinking boat with increasingly efficient boot. I want to go back now to the question of how all of this could have happened. How a sophisticated intelligence apparatus in a nation with a long tradition of rigorous intellectual analysis could have gotten something so large and so consequential, so completely wrong. Because I think this is the most important part of the story, and it's the part most easily lost in the drama of battles and the statistics of production. The answer isn't that the German analysts were stupid. Some of them were extraordinarily intelligent. The answer isn't simply that they lacked information. Much of the relevant information was publicly available. The answer is that they were operating within a system that had structured epistemic norms, unwritten but absolutely real rules about what kind of analysis was permissible, what conclusions were acceptable, what questions could be asked, and which ones couldn't. Authoritarian political systems have a particular and well-documented relationship with intelligence. In a healthy intelligence environment, the purpose of analysis is to tell leadership what is true, so that leadership can make better decisions. In a politically coercive environment, analysis shifts its purpose, consciously or unconsciously, toward telling leadership what it wants to hear, because that is what produces rewards rather than punishment. Over time, this produces not just individual acts of dishonesty, but a corruption of the entire analytical process, a systematic bias toward preferred conclusions that is difficult to identify and even more difficult to correct. The Nazi state was an extreme example of this dynamic, but it was not a unique one. The same pattern appears in other authoritarian systems throughout history. The key mechanism is the same: a leadership that holds strong ideological commitments, combined with sufficient political power to reward compliance and punish dissent, will eventually produce an intelligence apparatus that tells it what it wants to hear. And an intelligence apparatus that tells its leadership what it wants to hear is not an intelligence apparatus at all. It is a rationalization machine. In Germany's case, the ideological commitments were specific and radical. Hitler's worldview was built on racial theories that assign categorical superiority and inferiority to different peoples. The United States was, in that framework, categorically inferior, racially mixed, politically degenerate, culturally soft. Any intelligence assessment that suggested American capability was high ran directly against this ideological commitment, and any analyst who produced such an assessment was implicitly challenging the ideological foundation of the state. The result was predictable in retrospect. The assessments reflected the ideology. The ideology shaped the strategy. The strategy assumed American weakness And when American strength became undeniable, when the numbers from the factories were too large to ignore, when the tanks and aircraft and ships arrived in quantities that hadn't been modeled, when American soldiers who had been dismissed as soft proved capable of fighting and learning and fighting again, the strategy had no answer. What was even more damaging than the individual failures of assessment was the cumulative effect on German strategic planning, because German strategy in the Second World War was, at its core, a strategy of speed. Hit fast. Destroy the enemy's military capacity before they can mobilize their economic and demographic reserves. Win before the arithmetic catches up with you. This strategy had worked in Poland. It had worked brilliantly in France. It had nearly worked against the Soviet Union. In each case, the key was the same. Win decisively before the enemy can bring their full power to bear. The strategy assumed, ad tua summa, that the enemy's full power would take a long time to materialize. It was a strategy predicated on the belief that Germany's opponents were slow to mobilize, slow to learn, slow to adaptation. It was a strategy that could not survive an enemy that could mobilize fast, learn fast, and adapt fast. The United States was exactly that enemy. And German intelligence had told Hitler it was something else. I want to close by asking a question I find genuinely haunting, one that goes beyond the historical record into the realm of counterfactual history, but that I think helps us understand what was actually at stake. What if German intelligence had been right? Not about the racial theories. Those were toxic delusions that caused unmeasurable suffering and would have corroded whatever they touched. But about the specific strategic calculation regarding American industrial mobilization. What if the American conversion to war production had actually taken 2 or 3 years rather than 2 or 3 months? What if the Liberty ships had taken 8 months to build rather than 24 days? What if the American aircraft industry had produced 30,000 planes in the war rather than 300,000? The numbers matter here. They matter because German strategy depended on a specific timeline. If Germany could dominate the continent of Europe, knock out France, manage Britain, defeat the Soviet Union before American industrial and military power could be mobilized and brought to bear, perhaps a kind of stable equilibrium could be achieved. A fortress Europe that American power could not penetrate. A fait accompli that Roosevelt, however willing, lacked the material capacity to reverse. This wasn't a crazy hope. It wasn't pure fantasy. It was an assessment of a possible future that depended critically on the one variable German intelligence consistently and catastrophically misjudged: how fast and how completely American industry could convert from peace to war. The answer, as it turned out, was faster and more completely than anyone outside the United States fully believed possible. And the reason it could do so is worth understanding clearly. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't fortune. It was the product of decades of development of a particular kind of industrial capitalism, flexible, decentralized, innovative, driven by competition and incentive, that had built exactly the kind of productive base that could be redirected at speed. The same characteristics of American capitalism that had produced the Great Depression, the speculative excess, the financial instability, the boom and bust cycles, had also produced, in the decades of growth that preceded it, an industrial infrastructure of extraordinary scale and versatility. The very disorder of American economic development, which Hitler viewed as evidence of weakness, was in fact the source of its adaptability. A more tightly controlled, more centrally planned economy might have produced more stability in peacetime and less disruptive vulnerability to financial shocks. But it would not have produced Willow Run. It would not have produced the Liberty ship. It would not have produced an industrial base capable of turning itself into a weapons factory in the space of a few months. The ideological blinders that prevented German intelligence from seeing American strength weren't just wrong in their conclusions. They were wrong in their premises. The premise that racial homogeneity produces national strength. The premise that democratic political culture produces weakness and division. The premise that the disorder and plurality of a free society make it incapable of serious collective effort. All of these premises were tested against reality in the years between 1941 and 1945, and reality won. I think about Hans Dieckhoff writing his memoranda in 1938, warning that events were leading toward a war. Germany could not survive. I think about Canaris running an intelligence organization in a state that couldn't tolerate his conclusions, eventually hanged for his resistance. I think about the Abwehr analysts who looked at American production statistics and knew what they meant, but wrote what was expected of them. I think about George walking into FBI headquarters with $175,000 in his bags and the weight of a refusal on his conscience. And I think about what it costs. The real, measured, historical costs in human lives and human suffering when powerful institutions choose comfortable illusion over uncomfortable truth. 50 million people died in that war. 6 million of them in the camps whose existence and purpose German intelligence had also, in its own way, supported and protected by telling leadership what it wanted to hear. An entire continent reduced to rubble. A generation of young men buried in foreign soil. Cities that had stood for centuries turned to ash. That is the price of the intelligence failure we've been discussing. Not in the abstract, not as a historical footnote. That is what it cost when German intelligence looked at the United States of America and told its leadership. Soft, divided, racially contaminated, industrially limited, politically paralyzed. Not a real threat. The factories had a different answer. Ford at Willow Run, Kaiser on the West Coast, Chrysler in Detroit, Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, North American in California, hundreds of other plants and facilities across a continent that German bombers could never reach, producing material at rates that German planners could never model because their ideological framework made the numbers inadmissible. A B-24 every 63 minutes, 300,000 aircraft, 2/3 of all Allied military equipment in the entire war, from a country German intelligence had written off. The factories didn't care what the analysts said. They just kept building, and eventually, what they built was enough to end the war. Crack open the camps, free the occupied nations, and demonstrate, at a cost in blood and time and treasure that should never be forgotten. What happens to military strategies built on ideological lies about what your enemies are capable of? If that story means something to you, if you think it's worth understanding, worth remembering, worth telling, I hope you'll stay with us. There are more stories to tell, none of them simple. All of them worth your time. I'll see you in the next one. There is a subplot to this story that deserves its own extended telling, because it illuminates the German miscalculation from a different angle and shows how the same failure of industrial assessment played out in a specific military campaign with consequences as large as any battle of the war. The German submarine campaign in the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic, as Churchill called it, was the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War. It began in September 1939, when German U-boats first targeted Allied shipping. And it didn't end until Germany surrendered in May 1945. For most of that period, it represented Germany's best chance to actually affect American industrial capacity, not by bombing the factories, which was geographically impossible, but by preventing the output of those factories from reaching the battlefronts where it was needed. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. The United States could produce all the aircraft and tanks and guns and ammunition it wanted, but if the ships carrying that material to Britain and the Soviet Union were being sunk in the Atlantic, the material never arrived. A rifle at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean is no more useful than a rifle that was never manufactured. If Germany could sink ships faster than America could build them, the production advantage would be neutralized. In the early phases of the war, and particularly in the first months after America entered, this strategy came uncomfortably close to working. Grand Admiral Karl D. Nitze commanded the U-boat fleet, understood the arithmetic of the campaign clearly. He needed to sink approximately 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month to overcome British imports and force a strategic defeat. In the terrible months of 1942, German submarines were achieving sinking rates that approached this target, the period that American naval historians call the Second Happy Time, from January through July 1942, when U-boats ranged freely along the American East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. Sinking tankers and freighters within sight of resort beaches was one of the most catastrophic stretches of Allied naval losses in the entire war. American coastal defense was, in the spring of 1942, genuinely inadequate. Ships silhouetted against the lights of coastal cities made easy targets. Anti-submarine patrols were thin and poorly equipped. The convoy system that had been developed in the First World War and proved effective against U-boats was slow to be reached. In those months, a German submarine commander could achieve sinkings almost at will along the American coast, which submariners called the American shooting season or the American turkey shoot. Dönitz requested more submarines. He had calculated that with 300 operational U-boats, he could win the Battle of the Atlantic and strangle Britain. He never got 300 operational submarines. He rarely had more than a fraction of that number. German submarine construction was limited by the same industrial capacity constraints that limited everything else in the German war economy, and the Allies were simultaneously developing the anti-submarine capabilities, improved radar, depth charges, better tactics, long-range patrol aircraft, eventually escort carriers, that would eventually turn the campaign against the U.S. But the deeper issue was the one that German naval planning had never seriously gamed out: American shipbuilding capacity. Dönitz's entire strategy depended on a calculation of Allied ship losses versus Allied ship construction. If losses exceeded construction, Britain would eventually be strangled of supplies. If construction exceeded losses, the campaign would fail no matter how many ships were sunk. And German naval intelligence had assessed American shipbuilding capacity as modest, constrained by infrastructure, by skilled labor, by peacetime investment levels. Henry Kaiser. Kaiser was a 60-year-old California industrialist with absolutely no background in shipbuilding when the war began. He had built dams and roads and bridges. He was a construction man, not a naval architect. But he was extraordinarily good at the thing that mattered most in wartime production: rapid, large-scale construction using prefabrication and mass production techniques that the existing ship industry had never considered applying to ships. The Liberty ship was the result, an unglamorous, utilitarian cargo vessel with no military value except its capacity to carry things: food, fuel, ammunition, aircraft components, vehicles, everything that modern war required. Kaiser didn't design a beautiful ship. He designed a producible ship, a ship whose hull could be built in sections, prefabricated at inland facilities, transported to the shipyard, and welded together on the slipway in a fraction of the time that traditional riveted ship construction required. At Kaiser's Richmond, California shipyard, the average construction time for a Liberty ship fell from about 230 days in early 1942 to 72 days by later that year to 24 days in 1943. His most famous demonstration, partly a publicity stunt but built on real process improvements, launched a ship named the Robert E. Peary just 4 days and 15.5 hours after the keel was laid. The Germans were sinking ships at a rate measured in hundreds of thousands of tons per month. American yards were launching them at a rate that more than kept pace with the losses. By the second half of 1942, Allied ship construction was exceeding Allied ship losses. By 1943, new construction was running far ahead of losses. By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic was effectively over, not because U-boats had been eliminated, but because the losses they inflicted were insignificant relative to the production output they were trying to interdict. Germany had launched the longest military campaign of the war. It had committed its submarine fleet to a strategy of attrition, and it had lost not because its submarines were inferior, not because its submariners weren't brave, but because the underlying economic calculation on which the entire campaign rested was wrong. American shipbuilding could not produce ships at the rate German intelligence had assessed. It could produce ships at several times that rate. And once that reality manifested in the Atlantic, the entire German naval strategy became a war of attrition that Germany was losing. There's an aspect of the American industrial contribution to the war that I think is underappreciated, even by people who know the production statistics. It's the concept of surplus. When Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, he was authorizing the transfer of American war material to Britain, and eventually to other allies. The scale of what ultimately flowed through Lend-Lease, approximately $50 billion in wartime dollars, which is something in the range of $700 billion or more in contemporary value, is staggering on its own terms. But what's even more remarkable is what Lend-Lease implied about American industrial capacity. You do not send nearly $50 billion worth of war material to other countries if your own industrial base is struggling to equip your own forces. You only do that if your industrial base has capacity to spare, if it is producing so much that it can simultaneously arm the American military, arm the British military, arm the Soviet military, and still have output left over. German intelligence saw Lend-Lease as evidence of American political intentions, as proof that the United States was moving toward intervention, as a propaganda move, as a sign of Roosevelt's alignment with the Allied cause. What German intelligence failed to grasp was the industrial implication. Lend-Lease was American industry showing its hand. It was demonstrating, months before Pearl Harbor, that the productive capacity of the United States had already exceeded what a nation at peacetime levels of military preparedness required. The Soviet component of Lend-Lease deserves particular attention, because it's sometimes underappreciated in Western tellings of the war. Over the course of the conflict, the United States shipped to the Soviet Union, among many other things, over 400,000 trucks and jeeps, approximately 14,000 aircraft, about 13,000 armored vehicles, including tanks, and enormous quantities of food, communications equipment, boots, and raw materials. The trucks are particularly significant. When Soviet historians and later Russian historians speak of the Great Patriotic War, they emphasize Soviet industrial production and Soviet sacrifice, which were both real and enormous. What they tend to underemphasize is how dependent Soviet operational mobility was on American vehicles. The Red Army's ability to conduct the massive encirclement operations of 1943 and 1944, the battles that destroyed entire German army groups, that drove the Wehrmacht from the Dnieper to the Vistula to the Oder, depended critically on the motorized logistics that allowed Soviet forces to maintain operational tempo across enormous distances. And a significant component of that motorized logistics was American trucks. German intelligence, in assessing the Soviet-German front, was tracking Soviet tanks and aircraft and infantry. It was not seriously tracking the American material flowing into the Soviet Union through the Persian Corridor and the Arctic convoys. And across the Pacific, it was not modeling what American trucks would do to Soviet operational mobility. And the consequence of that failure to model was that German assessments of Soviet military capacity continued to underestimate what the Red Army could actually accomplish in 1943 and 1944. The broader point is this: Germany was fighting not just the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union as separate entities. It was fighting an interconnected industrial and military system in which American production capacity was flowing simultaneously into all three Allied militaries, amplifying their capabilities in ways that individual national assessments would never capture. You couldn't understand what the British RAF could do in 1943 without understanding American aircraft deliveries. You couldn't understand what the Soviet Army could do in 1944 without understanding American trucks. You couldn't understand what the American Army could do in 1944 without understanding the cumulative output of 3 years of wartime industrial mobilization. German intelligence assessed these military forces individually and got them individually wrong. What it never seriously attempted was a systemic analysis of the combined industrial and military capacity of the Allied coalition as a whole. And the reason it never seriously attempted that analysis is the same reason it got everything else wrong. The answer would have been too uncomfortable to report. There is one more dimension of German intelligence failure that I want to address, because it goes beyond the industrial and military into something more fundamental about how societies work under pressure. German intelligence assessed American society as politically fragile and socially divided, and in late 1940 and early 1941, there was some evidence for this assessment. American public opinion was genuinely divided about intervention in the European war. The America First movement, which argued for strict neutrality and opposed American involvement, had genuine mass support. Its leaders, including the celebrated aviator Charles Lindbergh, could draw tens of thousands to rallies. Isolationism was not a fringe position. It was a mainstream political current, with deep roots in American political culture and genuine popular support. There was also social division that German observers noted with interest. Racial conflict, most visible in the segregated South, but present throughout the country. Labor conflict between organized workers and management. Religious divisions, ethnic divisions, including significant communities of German Americans, Italian Americans, and Irish Americans who had complex or hostile relationships with the idea of fighting on Britain's side. Political divisions between Roosevelt's Democratic coalition and the Republican opposition. A free press that argued loudly and publicly about every aspect of American policy. German intelligence looked at all of this and concluded: weakness, division, paralysis. A society that was incapable of the unified national will that serious military effort required. What they misread was the difference between the surface noise of a democratic political culture and the underlying social cohesion that exists beneath it. Democratic societies argue. They disagree loudly and publicly about everything, all the time, as a matter of principle and practice. This looks, from the outside, like instability. What it actually is, in most cases, is a release valve for social tensions that in more authoritarian systems build up underground and explode unpredictably. Pearl Harbor did something to American society that German intelligence had never seriously modeled. It resolved, nearly overnight, the question of whether America would fight, not because Americans had become unanimous in their views on everything else, not because the social divisions had disappeared, but because an act of war against the United States had cut through all the political complexity and produced something very close to national consensus on one specific question. This enemy had attacked us, and we were going to respond. The speed with which American public opinion shifted after Pearl Harbor from roughly 30% supporting war with Germany in early December 1941 to something approaching 90% within days was not an accident of political culture. It was a feature of democratic systems. They can be slow to commit, but once committed, they commit hard. And once committed, the productive capacity of the society, the organizational energy, the creative problem-solving, the individual initiative, the willingness to sacrifice mobilizes in ways that are genuinely difficult for authoritarian systems to match. Think about what American workers were doing in the war years. They were working double shifts. They were working weekends. They were accepting housing arrangements and working conditions they would have rejected in peacetime. They were buying war bonds voluntarily out of their own income, investing their savings in the national war effort. They were sending their sons and brothers and husbands to fight. They were accepting rationing of gasoline and rubber and food and scores of other goods so that the military could have what it needed. This wasn't coercion. It wasn't the product of a state security apparatus enforcing compliance. It was voluntary sacrifice, widely and genuinely offered by a population that understood what the war was about and believed in the cause. And it produced productive results in the quality of the work, in the willingness to innovate, in the speed of industrial conversion that coerced labor in authoritarian systems consistently fails to match. American women entered the industrial workforce during the war in enormous numbers. The famous image of Rosie the Riveter was propaganda, but it was propaganda grounded in a real phenomenon. Millions of women who had never worked in a factory took jobs in defense plants, learned new skills, and contributed to production levels that would have been impossible without them. African American workers, despite facing systematic discrimination and racial violence, fought for and in many places won access to defense industry jobs that had been closed to them before the war, and contributed to production that the segregated assumptions of the pre-war economy had excluded them from. German intelligence had noted the racial divisions in American society and concluded, this weakens them. What it failed to model was the possibility that a society could absorb its internal contradictions, while still directing its productive capacity toward a unified external goal. That the racial divisions and the labor conflicts and the political arguments were, in wartime, subordinated to a higher-order mobilization objective that most Americans, whatever their other differences, genuinely shared. Roosevelt understood this. It was the central political insight of his wartime presidency. The arsenal of democracy was not just a production slogan, it was a political frame. a way of telling Americans that what they were doing in the factories was as genuinely patriotic and as genuinely consequential as what their sons were doing on the beaches and in the air. It gave industrial mobilization a moral and civic dimension that made it feel like participation in something important, not just economic obligation. German intelligence saw political rhetoric. What it was actually looking at was one of the most effective political mobilizations in modern democratic history, a society that had been genuinely divided about its role in the world agreeing, suddenly and massively, on what needed to be done, and then doing it with the full creative and productive energy of a free people committed to a cause they believed in. I want to close the substantive analysis of this story by tracing the direct line from American industrial production to military outcome, because the connection, while obvious in retrospect, was exactly what German strategy refused to believe possible. By the end of 1942, the outline of what was coming was visible to anyone who looked at the numbers honestly. American industrial mobilization was not years away. It was already happening. The aircraft were rolling out of the factories. The ships were launching from the yards. The tanks were moving off the assembly lines. The training camps were turning recruits into soldiers at a rate that was filling new divisions and shipping them to theaters of war every month. In North Africa, the first major engagement between American and German forces in 1942 and early 1943 ended in German defeat. Not primarily because American forces had outfought German forces, though by the end of the Tunisian campaign they were doing so, but because the logistical situation had become impossible for the Axis. American and British naval dominance of the Mediterranean meant that German and Italian forces in North Africa were receiving a trickle of the supplies they needed, while Allied forces were receiving whatever they required. Rommel, who was one of the most tactically brilliant German commanders of the war, lost not because he was outgeneraled, but because he ran out of fuel and ammunition in a theater where his opponents had an inexhaustible supply of both. Italy followed. Sicily fell. Then the mainland. The Italian campaign was costly and slow, but it opened a second front in Europe that tied down German divisions that were desperately needed elsewhere. 10. Normandy, Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious operation in history, put over 150,000 Allied troops ashore in France in a single day. The scale of the logistical achievement behind that landing is almost impossible to convey. Months of preparation. Millions of tons of material pre-positioned in Britain. Purpose-built artificial harbors. The Mulberry harbors towed across the channel. An entire artificial supply infrastructure created almost from scratch because the capacity existed to create it. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy was brutal and bloody and initially slow. German defenders were fierce. The bocage terrain favored defense. For weeks, it seemed possible that the invasion might be contained and that the Germans might maintain a coherent line. And then Operation Cobra broke the German lines. The breakout began, and the pace of the Allied advance became a function not of German resistance, which remained fierce, but of American logistics. Could American trucks and fuel supply lines keep pace with American tanks? In many cases, barely. The supply system was stretched to its limits and beyond, but the system existed, and it was vast, and it kept the armies moving. The liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Seine, the rush to the German border, and then the limits of even American logistics became apparent. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, Germany's last major offensive, succeeded initially partly because American supply lines were overextended and American formations were stretched thin. For a few weeks in December, it seemed possible that German forces might achieve a local success of strategic significance. They couldn't. The industrial arithmetic was too far against them. American forces had reserves of men and material that German forces couldn't match. The reserves were called forward. The bulge was reduced. The German army in the West, having expended its last significant reserves of fuel and armor, and experienced soldiers in the Ardennes offensive, lost the capacity to conduct any further serious offensive operations. The road to Berlin lay open. What had beaten them, in the end, was not primarily superior strategy, though Allied strategic decision-making in the last year of the war was generally sound. It was not primarily superior tactics, though American forces had learned and adapted in the years since Kasserine. It was the weight of material, The tanks and trucks and aircraft and fuel and ammunition and spare parts and food that flowed from the American industrial base in quantities that German forces, who were fighting for every liter of fuel and every artillery shell, simply could not match. Germany's defeat in the Second World War is sometimes narrated primarily as a Soviet achievement, and the Soviet contribution was indeed enormous, costing millions of lives and involving industrial feats of their own. But the industrial arithmetic that made the outcome inevitable has an American signature. The aircraft over German cities were American and British. The fuel that powered the Red Army's trucks was American. The food that kept British and Soviet soldiers alive while they fought was American. The ships that crossed the Atlantic to deliver it all were American-built, American-crewed. Germany's strategic mistake was not simply Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States. It was the entire chain of misjudgments, ideological, institutional, analytical, that had led to a war plan that could not account for what American industry was actually capable of doing. I want to take a few minutes at the end of this story to say something about what it means, not just as history, but as a lesson that extends beyond this specific moment. The German intelligence failure regarding American industrial capacity was not a failure of one man, or one institution, or one moment. It was a systemic failure, rooted in the nature of the political system that the Abwehr and the German General Staff were serving. And the lesson it carries is not a lesson specific to Nazi Germany, or even to authoritarian systems in general. It's a lesson about the relationship between ideology and intelligence that applies wherever human beings are trying to understand the world. Every institution, military, governmental, corporate, academic, develops institutional assumptions over time. These assumptions become load-bearing walls in the structure of how the institution thinks. Challenging them feels like challenging the structure itself. So they persist. They get reinforced by the hiring and promotion of people who share them. They shape what data gets collected, what questions get asked, what conclusions get considered plausible. And over time, they can diverge further and further from the reality they were originally meant to describe. The Germans had a set of load-bearing assumptions about American society, that racial mixture meant weakness, that democratic pluralism meant division, that the American industrial base was a paper tiger that would not mobilize effectively. These assumptions shaped everything. What data was sought, how it was interpreted, what conclusions were acceptable, what warnings were dismissed. The warnings were dismissed at enormous cost. Dieckhoff's memoranda were filed and forgotten. How Schaffer's assessment was noted and ignored. The production statistics that crossed the desks of Abwehr analysts were dismissed as propaganda. And when Operation Pastorius sent 8 men to disrupt American industrial production, it turned out that some of those men had absorbed enough of American society to choose America over Nazi Germany when the moment came. I think there's something important in that last detail. George Dasch and Ernest Berger, the 2 men who refused to go through with the mission, weren't heroes in any traditional sense. They were, by any strict assessment, traitors to the state that had trained them, but they were people who, when they looked honestly at what they were being asked to do, saw the reality of what they were confronting more clearly than the planners who had sent them. They saw an America that was real, that had been real to them in the years they had lived there, and they couldn't do what the ideology demanded. The ideology said, America is weak, divided, corrupt, racially contaminated, militarily insignificant. The men who had actually lived there said, that's not what we saw. The factories said, that's not what we are. And the outcome of the war, written in 50 million dead, and in the liberation of the camps, and in the physical reconstruction of a shattered continent, is the definitive answer to the question of which description was accurate. Remember this story the next time someone with a lot of power tells you that an opponent is weaker than they appear. Remember Dieckhoff's memoranda. Remember the production numbers. Remember a B-24 Liberator rolling off the line at Willow Run every 63 minutes. The factories didn't care what the ideology said. They just kept building. I've been speaking about German contempt for America in broad terms. But I want to get specific, because the texture of that contempt is historically significant and helps explain why it was so resistant to correction. German visitors to the United States in the 1930s, diplomats, journalists, businessmen, intelligence operatives came back with remarkably consistent impressions. And those impressions were filtered through a particular cultural and ideological lens that systematically misread what they were seeing. They saw, first of all, the Great Depression. When the Nazis came to power in January 1933, the United States was at the nadir of its worst economic crisis. Unemployment stood above 25%. Banks had been failing for years. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Industrial production had collapsed to half its 1929 levels. Farms were being foreclosed across the Midwest. The American economy was, by any objective measure, in catastrophic condition. German observers looked at this and drew the ideological conclusions that their framework invited. American capitalism had failed. The democratic system had proven incapable of managing a modern industrial economy. The racial and cultural contradictions of American society were tearing it apart from within. Here was the proof that the German model, authoritarian, nationally unified, racially coherent, was superior to the American model of democratic pluralism and market capitalism. What they missed was the underlying resilience and productive capacity of an economy that was temporarily, if severely, depressed. The steel mills that stood idle in 1933 were still there. The railroads that ran on reduced schedules were still there. The trained workers who had been laid off were still there, with their skills intact. The technical knowledge, the organizational infrastructure, the physical plant, all of it was there, waiting for conditions to change. German observers also looked at American racial divisions with a particular combination of fascination and contempt. The segregation of the American South, the disenfranchisement of Black Americans, the lynchings and racial violence, these were, in the Nazi ideological framework, evidence that even Americans understood racial hierarchy, and simultaneously evidence that American society was torn by the contradictions of a multiracial population that it couldn't, honestly, manage. What the German observers couldn't model was the eventual possibility that America might begin, however slowly and painfully, to extend its productive potential to the population segments it had previously excluded. African American workers who entered defense plants during the war didn't just fill positions left by men who had gone to fight. They expanded the total productive capacity of the American economy by bringing skills and labor that had been wastefully excluded from the industrial workforce. Women who entered factories expanded productive capacity in the same way. The mobilization of previously excluded groups was, in aggregate, a significant source of the productive surge that so astonished German observers. German intelligence had assessed American racial and social divisions as weaknesses. They were real weaknesses. But in the context of wartime mobilization, they also represented reservoirs of untapped productive potential that, when partly tapped by the conditions of wartime, contributed to the output that overwhelmed German calculations. There's something ironic, dark and pointed ironic, in this observation. The Nazi ideology of racial hierarchy, which dismissed multiracial American society as contaminated and inferior, missed the fact that the very diversity it despised was, in a functional industrial system with at least some degree of meritocratic economic opportunity, a source of productive strength. Germany's own ideology excluded from productive contribution the very population's Jewish scientists, Jewish businessmen, Jewish professionals, political opponents of every background whose talents might, in different circumstances, have contributed to its war economy. While Germany was stripping Jews of their citizenship, their property, and eventually, their lives, the United States was imperfectly, inconsistently, against resistance, expanding the circle of people who could contribute to its industrial mobilization. I don't want to overstate this or make it sound cleaner than it was. American racism during the Second World War was real and destructive. The exclusion of Black Americans from much of the defense industry in the early war years was not a minor inconvenience, but a significant economic waste and a profound moral failure. The internment of Japanese Americans was a civil rights atrocity. The treatment of women workers, who were systematically excluded from the highest paying and most skilled positions, was discriminatory. American society in 1941 to 1945 was emphatically not a model of equality. But even with all of those failures and exclusions, American society mobilized more of its human potential for industrial production than German intelligence had thought possible. And the reason it could do so, even while preserving its divisions and contradictions, is the same reason its economic institutions had produced the industrial base that German intelligence had dismissed as temporary and unsustainable. Flexibility, adaptability, the capacity to respond to changing conditions in ways that systems organized around a rigid ideological hierarchy cannot easily do. One of the most important and underappreciated aspects of this intelligence failure is the question of information availability. Because the standard assumption that Germany failed to understand American industrial capacity because it lacked information is actually wrong. The information was largely available. The failure was analytical and ideological, not informational. American industrial production figures were published publicly, in newspapers, in government reports, in congressional testimony, in corporate annual reports, in trade publications. The United States in 1940 and 1941 was an open society with a free press, and the statistics of its industrial base were not state secrets. They were available to any analyst who wanted to look them up and think about them clearly. German intelligence had access to American newspapers. It had agents who could read American trade publications. It had diplomatic staff in Washington until December 1941 who could observe American economic mobilization directly. The data that would have supported an accurate assessment of American industrial potential was sitting in plain sight. What German intelligence lacked was not access to the information, but the analytical framework and the institutional freedom to interpret it correctly. An analyst who looked at the American automobile industry in 1940, using assembly lines and mass production techniques of extraordinary sophistication, and thought seriously about what would happen if that production capacity were redirected to tanks, aircraft engines, and military vehicles, should have been able to project production numbers that were far beyond what German official assessments allowed. The automobile comparison is worth dwelling on, because it was genuinely available and genuinely informative to anyone who wanted to do the analysis honestly. Making an automobile requires sheet metal fabrication, precision machining, engine manufacturing, electrical systems assembly, final assembly line operations, quality control, and logistics. Making an aircraft requires most of the same capabilities, plus composites work and somewhat higher precision tolerances on certain components. Making a tank requires similar capabilities, plus heavier steel fabrication and somewhat different assembly procedures. Making a military truck is, in many respects, simpler than making a civilian car. An American automobile industry, producing 3.5 million cars per year in 1940, represented a productive base that, if redirected, could not produce 3.5 million aircraft per year. Aircraft are more complex, and the raw materials are different, but it could produce something in the range of hundreds of thousands of aircraft per year. This was not hidden information. It was derivable from publicly available data by anyone willing to do the arithmetic without ideological blinders. The German economists and industrial analysts who were supposed to be doing this work were not stupid. Some of them understood perfectly well what the numbers implied. The problem was institutional. If you did the arithmetic and arrived at American aircraft production figures that contradicted official assessments, what did you do with your analysis? You could submit it and watch it get buried or rejected. You could suppress your own findings to avoid the professional consequences. Or you could shade your analysis enough to make it acceptable to your supervisors, understanding that the precise truth would be unwelcome. Over time, this kind of institutional pressure produces a systemic bias, not individual lies, necessarily, though those occurred too. A systemic orientation toward acceptable conclusions, toward numbers that fell within the range that leadership could tolerate. And the cumulative effect was an official picture of American industrial capacity that was, by the early 1940s, so badly wrong that it couldn't survive contact with reality. The information was there. The analysis was possible. The institutional framework made the correct analysis professionally suicidal to produce. I want to tell you about the German military planners, not the politicians or but the professional soldiers, who are responsible for translating strategic decisions into operational plans, because some of them understood the situation with considerably more clarity than the official assessments acknowledged. And what they did with that understanding is, in its own way, one of the most revealing aspects of this story. There were German military officers who had studied the United States seriously. They had read American industrial statistics, looked at American military potential, and arrived at conclusions that were far more pessimistic from the German perspective than anything they felt free to put in official documents. These officers existed throughout in the planning staffs of the various service branches. In the Foreign Army's West Intelligence Department, that was responsible for assessing Western Allied capabilities, some of them wrote cautious private memoranda. Some confided their concerns to trusted colleagues. Some, like the German ambassador Dietschoff, put their concerns on paper for the record, understanding that the record would probably be ignored, but wanting it to exist. A few, later, wrote memoirs that described how they had known the war was unwinnable once certain strategic thresholds had been crossed. Admiral Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, was privately opposed to the declaration of war on the United States and argued against it. Understood better than Hitler the naval implications. The United States Navy, added to the Royal Navy, created a combined Allied naval strength that made any German strategic maritime operation essentially impossible. The U-boat campaign might continue, but the kind of naval power projection that might have given Germany strategic options in the Atlantic was now permanently off the table. Raeder made his concerns known. They were overridden. General Franz Halder, who served as chief of the German Army General Staff from 1938 to 1942, kept a diary that is one of the most valuable documents of the war's planning history. Reading through it, you can see the moments where Halder's private assessments diverged sharply from official optimism. He was not a man given to defeatism, but he was an honest analyst, and his diary records the growing gaps between what official assessments claimed and what the actual operational situation showed. By mid-1941, in the early months of Operation Halder was recording observations about the Soviet Union's capacity to generate new military formations, observations that contradicted the official Abwehr assessment of Soviet strength. Every time German forces destroyed what they had been told was a significant fraction of Soviet military capacity, new formations appeared that hadn't been in the order of battle. By August 1941, Halder wrote in his diary a comment that has become something of a historical touchstone, that Russia kept generating new divisions as if from an inexhaustible source. This was not propaganda. This was an operational reality that the official assessments had never modeled. The same phenomenon was playing out at longer range and with less immediate visibility. With respect to American industrial production, the official assessments said American production was modest and would remain so. The reality, for those who were honestly looking, was that American production was accelerating rapidly in 1941 and would continue to do so for years. The gap between the official picture and the operational reality was going to become, eventually, impossible to ignore. By the end of 1942, it was impossible to ignore. The tonnage flowing from American factories, the equipment arriving on the Allied side, the ships launching from American yards, all of it was too visible, too documented, to present in the physical evidence of Allied military capability to be dismissed as propaganda any longer. Even the most committed ideological true believers in the German military system were by late 1942 confronting a material reality that their assessments had told them couldn't exist, but by then, the strategic options had been exhausted. The moment when correct intelligence could have changed German strategy, the late 1930s, when the decision to pursue war against the Western powers was being made, had passed. The decisions had been made. The forces were committed, the strategic trajectory was set, and no amount of honest reassessment, at this point, could reverse the fundamental arithmetic. This is one of the cruelest aspects of strategic intelligence failure at the highest level. The period when correct analysis could change strategy is often quite narrow. Once a nation is committed to a course of action, once its military forces are deployed and its resources are engaged, the capacity to reverse course diminishes rapidly. The intelligence failure regarding American industrial capacity happened in the late 1930s and early 1940s, when Germany was still making strategic choices. By the time the failure was undeniably apparent, the choices had been made, the options had been foreclosed, and the catastrophe was in progress. Albert Speer deserves extended treatment in any honest account of this story, because he is in some ways the most interesting figure in the German war economy, a man of genuine ability who understood the situation clearly, worked with extraordinary energy to address it, and ultimately could not overcome the arithmetic. Speer became Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production in February 1942, following the sudden death of Fritz Todt in an aircraft accident. He was 36 years old. He was an architect by training. He had never run a major industrial organization, and he immediately demonstrated a grasp of industrial management and organizational reform that transformed German war production in ways that still astonish historians. When Speer took over, German armaments production was wasteful, fragmented, and politically compromised. Different military services were competing for the same raw materials and skilled labor. Manufacturing standards were inconsistent, making repairs and maintenance in the field more difficult. Production priorities shifted constantly in response to Hitler's personal enthusiasms and the immediate pressures of the military situation. Speer brought order, standardized specifications, rationalized production, reduced the wasteful duplication of effort. The results were remarkable. German tank production in 1943 was more than twice what it had been in 1941. Aircraft production increased significantly. The German war economy in 1944 was producing more military equipment than it had at any earlier point in the war. Even as Allied bombing was imposing growing costs on German industrial infrastructure, Speer understood, probably better than anyone else in the German government, exactly where the ceiling was. He had detailed figures on German productive capacity. He had comparative data on Allied production. He could do the arithmetic, and by 1943, if not earlier, he knew that the arithmetic didn't work. In one famous episode, Speer presented Hitler with production statistics showing the growing gap between German and Allied output. Hitler's response was to tell him that the Allied statistics were exaggerated, that American production figures in particular were propaganda, impossible to achieve, designed to demoralize the German people rather than reflect reality. This was August or September 1943. American factories were, by that point, producing thousands of aircraft per month, the B-17 and B-24 fleets that were bombing. German cities were visible evidence of American production capacity that no amount of propaganda dismissal could wish away. The planes were there. They were dropping bombs on German territory. And Hitler was still telling his armaments minister that American production figures were exaggerated. Speer knew they weren't exaggerated. He knew exactly how much American factories were producing, within reasonable margins of error. He knew that the production gap was growing, not shrinking. He knew that German industry, for all the gains he had achieved, was falling further behind, not in output per unit of capacity, which Speer had genuinely improved, but in total capacity, which Allied bombing was degrading while American industry was operating from a base that was immune to bombing. He continued to work. He continued to find efficiencies, to reduce waste, to push production higher. It was, in a real sense, admirable work, technically accomplished, organizationally sophisticated, carried out against political obstacles that would have defeated a less determined man. And it made no strategic difference whatsoever, because the gap it was trying to close was far too large for incremental efficiency gains to bridge. By late 1944, the German economy was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing, fuel shortages, the destruction of the transportation infrastructure, and the loss of occupied territory with its resources and labor. Speer knew the war was lost. He began, in ways that were later documented at Nuremberg, to resist Hitler's scorched earth orders, to destroy German industrial infrastructure as the Allied armies advanced. He was preserving what was left of the German economy for the German people who would have to live in whatever came after the war. Speer's story is in many ways a tragedy of capability without correct strategic premises. He was one of the most competent industrial managers of the 20th century, and he spent the most important years of his professional life trying to compensate for an intelligence and strategic failure that had made the war he was managing unwinnable before he ever took office. His testimony after the war about the impossibility of closing the production gap with the Allies, and specifically with the United States, is some of the most honest and analytically clear documentation we have of what German strategic planners knew, and when they knew it. The gap, he consistently said, was too large. The starting point was too different. The United States had too much capacity, too much flexibility, Too much surplus. Nothing that German industry could do in the circumstances it was operating under could bridge that gap. The failure to understand that, at a point when German strategy could still have avoided the war that made the gap, failed was the intelligence failure that mattered. I've mentioned Willow Run several times in this story, and I want to give it the full treatment it deserves, because in a war full of dramatic moments on beaches and in the skies, the story of a factory in rural Michigan is as important as any of them. The Willow Run bomber plant was conceived in 1940, when Charles Sorensen, the Ford Motor Company's chief production engineer, visited the Consolidated Aircraft facility in San Diego, California, where the B-24 Liberator bomber was then being produced. The B-24 was America's primary long-range heavy bomber, a four-engine aircraft of considerable complexity. 450,000 individual parts, more than 300,000 rivets, systems for fuel, hydraulics, electrical power, armament, navigation, communications, and crew life support. Building one of them was a sophisticated manufacturing challenge. Sorensen watched Consolidated's workforce building B-24s, the way aircraft had always been built, craftsmen moving from aircraft to aircraft, each one a slightly individual project, requiring skilled labor at every stage. It was quality work. It was slow work. At the rate Consolidated was producing B-24s at the start of the war, it would have taken decades to build the numbers the military required. Sorensen went back to Detroit. He and his team spent a weekend designing what would become the largest factory in the world. A building of almost 67 acres under a single roof, housing a mile-long assembly line that would apply the principles of automobile mass production to the manufacture of heavy bombers. The key insight was the same one that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing decades earlier. Break the complex manufacturing process into simple, repeatable steps that could be performed by semi-skilled workers using standardized tooling. Move the work to the workers instead of the workers to the work. Standardize every component so that any given part will fit any given aircraft. Build the systems that test, inspect, and coordinate the work into the production process itself, rather than relying on individual craftsman judgment. The plant began construction in April 1941. It was not an easy project. The scale of the building was unprecedented. The tooling for mass-producing aircraft components was enormously complex to develop. The workforce had to be recruited, housed, and trained at peak employment. Willow Run employed about 42,000 workers, many of them from small towns and rural areas across Michigan and the surrounding states who had never seen a factory of this scale, let alone worked in one. The early months were troubled. Production rates were far below targets. Quality control was problematic. The complexity of the aircraft, combined with a workforce that was still learning, produced bottlenecks and defects and delays that gave critics ammunition to question the entire concept. Some in the military establishment doubted that automobile-style mass production could ever work for aircraft of the B-24's complexity. Then the production curve began to climb. By the spring of 1942, the factory was beginning to hit its stride. Workers who had spent months learning were now experienced. The production processes had been debugged and refined. The quality control systems were working. Month by month, the output numbers rose 75 aircraft per month, then 100, then 150, then approaching 200 as the facility reached toward its design capacity. By 1944, Willow Run was producing completed B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate that no one in 1940 would have believed possible. The precise figure at peak production was approximately 650 aircraft per month. A finished, flight-ready, four-engine heavy bomber rolling off the line every 63 minutes, not assembled in batches. Not completed over the course of a week, one every 63 minutes, day and night, around the clock. The B-24 produced at Willow Run was identical in its essential specifications to the B-24 produced at Consolidated's facility in San Diego or at other manufacturers across the country. This was the crucial achievement. Standardization. Components made in Michigan fit aircraft assembled in California. When a B-24 was damaged in combat and needed replacement parts, those parts could be sourced from any manufacturer in the production network. and would fit without modification. When a pilot trained in a B-24 at one base transferred to a different base, the aircraft he flew was essentially the same machine. The mass production system had created not just individual aircraft, but an interchangeable fleet. Over the course of its operational life, Willow Run produced approximately 8,685 B-4 Liberator bombers, out of a total production run of approximately 80,482 B-24s. Across all manufacturers, Willow Run accounted for nearly half. One factory in rural Michigan, built on land that had been a soybean field in 1940, produced nearly half of America's primary long-range heavy bomber. I want you to think about what that means from a German strategic perspective. German intelligence had been tracking American aircraft production in the late 1930s and early 1940s. It had seen the numbers: 2,141 military aircraft in 1,939, 3,807 in 1940, 4,942 in 1941. These numbers were real. They were modest by the standards of what was coming, and they were the basis on which German assessments concluded that American aircraft production was not going to be strategically significant in the near term. They did not model Willow Run. They did not model Henry Ford's team applying mass production principles to aircraft manufacturing. They did not model what it meant when the most sophisticated industrial enterprise in the history of the world decided to put its full organizational genius into the problem of building heavy bombers as fast as possible. The concept was outside their framework. The numbers that followed: 26,277 military aircraft in 1,942, 85,898 in 1,943, 96,310 in 1944. The progression from fewer than 5,000 in 1941 to nearly 100,000 in 1944 is not a linear extrapolation from a historical trend. It is the signature of an industrial system that had solved a qualitatively different problem. Not how to build more aircraft using existing methods, but how to build aircraft in a fundamentally different way that operated at a completely different scale. German aircraft production over the same period, approximately 15,596 in 1,942, 25,527 inches, 1,943, 39,807 in 1944. The German numbers represent an extraordinary achievement. Speer's rationalization of German armaments production was working, and the increases were real. But even at their peak, in 1944, the Germans were producing about 40,000 aircraft per year to America's nearly 100,000. And those American aircraft were being built in factories that German bombers could not reach, by workers who were not being bombed, using materials that were not being By the time the Germans understood what American industry was actually doing, what Willow Run represented, what the Liberty ship represented, what the transformation of the American automobile industry into a weapons factory represented, the window for strategic adjustment had closed. Before we close, I want to address one more dimension of this story that is usually discussed separately, but belongs in this account of German intelligence failure. It concerns what Germany did to its own scientific and intellectual capability in the years before and during the war, and why that compounds the tragedy of the misjudgment we've been discussing. The Nazi racial ideology that led to such catastrophically wrong assessments of American industrial and social capacity also drove Germany to exile, imprison, and murder much of its own scientific talent. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 removed Jews from the civil service, academia, and most professional positions. Jewish scientists, including some of the most distinguished scientists in the world, left Germany or were driven out. The list of scientists who emigrated from Germany and Austria in the 1930s and went on to make extraordinary contributions to Allied science reads like a roster of the most important scientific minds of the 20th century. Albert Einstein, who had already left Germany before Hitler came to power but whose departure was made permanent by Nazi policies. Enrico Fermi, Italian rather than German, but who fled fascism and brought his extraordinary talents to the Manhattan Project. Leo Szilard, Eduard Teller, Eugene Wigner, Hungarian-born scientists who ended up in the United States and contributed to the development of atomic weapons. Hans Bethe, who fled Nazi Germany and became one of the most important theoretical physicists in the American atomic bomb program. Emilio Segre, Klaus Fuchs, and dozens of others. The Manhattan Project, the American program to develop the atomic bomb, succeeded partly because of the talent of native-born American scientists and partly because of the extraordinary contributions of European refugees who brought skills, knowledge, and perspectives that American science alone might not have assembled. Germany had driven away many of the scientists who were now working to defeat it. This is not, strictly speaking, an intelligence failure of the kind we've been discussing, but it is a consequence of the same ideological blindness. The racial ideology that dismissed American society as contaminated and inferior also dismissed the scientific contributions of Jewish and other non-Aryan scientists as racially unworthy, though it Pisik, the effort by some German physicists to define physics along racial lines, dismissing Einstein's relativity and other contributions of Jewish scientists as Jewish physics, was a real phenomenon that had real effects on German scientific development. Germany had begun the war with a lead in certain areas of weapons, technology, jet aircraft, rocketry, certain aspects of submarine design. It lost that lead, or failed to develop it as rapidly as it might have, partly because of the damage done to German science by ideological purges, and partly because the talent that had fled Germany was now working for the other side. The atomic bomb is the extreme case. Germany had the scientific basis in 1939 to pursue an atomic weapons program that might have succeeded. Its scientists, including Werner Heisenberg, understood the principles. It had the technical infrastructure, at least initially, to pursue the engineering challenge. What it lacked, ultimately, was the combination of scientific talent, industrial capacity, and organizational focus that the United States brought to the Manhattan Project. The industrial capacity question, the inability of German industry, particularly after 1943, to support the kind of massive, coordinated, resource-intensive program that building an atomic bomb required, is directly relevant to the story we've been telling. The same failure of industrial mobilization, the same constraints of a war economy fighting on multiple fronts, the same inability to match American productive capacity that limited German aircraft and tank production also limited German weapons research. And behind all of it was the same root cause, a worldview that had told German leaders that the enemy was weaker than it was, that the war could be won quickly, that the industrial arithmetic would work out, a worldview that had sent German scientists away, that had dismissed American industrial capacity as propaganda, that had celebrated Pearl Harbor as the moment when Japan's alliance had clinched the strategic situation, a worldview that had been wrong about everything that mattered. There is a specific date I want to give you, because I think it crystallizes everything we've been discussing in a way that no amount of retrospective analysis quite captures. On November 8, 1942, American and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch, the first major American ground offensive against German and Italian forces in the European and Mediterranean theater. In the 3 days of fighting that followed, American forces engaged Vichy French troops and began the process of establishing a presence in North Africa that would, within 7 months, result in the complete destruction of Axis forces on that continent. Those American soldiers who came ashore in Morocco and Algeria were carrying weapons made in American factories. They were wearing uniforms made in American textile plants. They were eating food produced on American farms and packaged in American processing plants. They were coordinating their operations using radios manufactured in American electronics plants. The ships that had carried them across the Atlantic were American-built. The aircraft providing air cover were American. The fuel powering their vehicles had come from American oil fields and American refineries. Less than 11 months had passed since Pearl Harbor. 11 months. That is how long it had taken the sleeping giant to project military power across an ocean and begin offensive ground operations in a theater thousands of miles from home. 11 months from a surprise attack that had damaged its Pacific Fleet to a combined arms, amphibious landing on the coast of Africa. German intelligence had not modeled this timeline. It couldn't have, because the timeline depended on American industrial and organizational capacity that German assessments had systematically refused to acknowledge. 11 months. Remember that number? The next time someone tells you that industrial democracies are slow to mobilize, that open societies are inefficient in wartime, that the disorder and plurality of free people make them incapable of serious collective effort. 11 months from Pearl Harbor to the shores of North Africa, 3 years from Pearl Harbor to Berlin. The factories had given the answer. They always do. In the end, the factories and the workers in them, and the society that understood why it was worth building as fast as they could. That is the story of how German intelligence misjudged American industrial might. And if you've stayed with me this long, you understand now not just what they got wrong, but why and what it ultimately cost. I'll see you in the next one.